matters. On Saturday, Fidel Castro, at the age of 90, one of the oldest leaders who had outserved 10 US presidents, passed away. He'd been the infamous, some would say, ruler of Cuba, leading it from a capitalist economy of, effectively the drudges of American imperialism and exploitation to what Cuba is today. But this has caused huge polarization and divide in media. You have had people from the left claiming he is, has basically created heaven on earth in Cuba. He is, someone who should be praised at all costs. And you have the right saying he was a brutal tyrant. Well, where is the truth on this line? To answer these questions, I'm very excited to answer. We have Dan Morley, editor of Socialist Appeal, coming down to answer this question. Dan's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and afterwards we've got a discussion, so people can feel free to make points, arguments, questions, in that sense. And feel free to come back on each other or come back on Dan if you like that, and I'll go on until everyone gets bored, or then we'll head off to the pub and get some booze. So, without further ado, Dan.
Okay. So Fidel Castro was born in 1926, 90 years ago, of course, in Biran, which is in the east of Cuba, into a family, actually, of relatively wealthy landowners. And he became active in politics, on the left, when he went to university, like many people, probably like many of you here. But before we go into the details of that and what he stood for and his journey, I think we also need to explain a little bit about the Cuba at the time that he lived in and that radicalized him. So Cuba was actually the last country in Latin America to be freed from Spanish imperialism, which I think was in 1898, as a byproduct of the war between the United States and Spain. And of course, in that epoch, in the late 19th century, this is the epoch when capitalism had become fully transformed into imperialism, when, in other words, the entire globe was divided up between giant imperial powers. Really, it was impossible for a small nation like Cuba within capitalism to win genuine freedom. So, of course, it's no coincidence that it won its freedom from Spain as a byproduct of a war between the old and the new imperial powers. And as a result of that, of course, Cuba's independence was largely, or even entirely, fictitious. It was completely dependent on the United States, and it really couldn't be any other way. This is the huge rising power right next door. It just defeated its old imperial master. And as a result, really, Cuba entered into a humiliating position in relation to the United States. As is widely known, was kind of like the local brothel and casino for the American bourgeoisie. And actually, this was really formalized in its winning of independence with the Platt Amendment, which basically allowed, it was written into the Cuban Constitution, that the United States could actually intervene at Cuba within Cuba militarily when it needed to. And that really expressed the reality of the way in which Cuba had gained its independence from Spain. So, as I said, although it was formally free, like so many other countries in the 20th century that won their freedom, like India or many other former colonial countries, their freedom and independence was really largely fictitious, and in practice continued to be dominated through the banking systems, etc., of the dominant imperial powers. And this produced within Cuba, of course, a burning sense of injustice and of national oppression, and a desire, of course, for real national sovereignty, which led to several waves of revolutionary activity, of revolutionary struggle in the first half of the 20th century. So, of course, that's the context that Fidel Castro was growing up in and went to university within. And he was inspired by the War of Independence and all of these other revolutionary struggles that had been taking place in Cuba. Now, Cuba actually had a relatively large working class, in other words, like an industrial, urban working class, as opposed to, say, a peasantry. Relatively large for a country like itself, a Latin American country. But they were really denied political leadership because the Cuban Communist Party, the main left party, the main workers' party within Cuba, of course affiliated to Moscow, to the Stalinists in Moscow, had a bizarre, when you actually know the details of Stalinist, of Moscow foreign policy, it's not so bizarre. But actually the Cuban Communist Party had a position of supporting the Batista dictatorship that was basically just an agency of American imperialism. So the government that Fidel helped to overthrow was the Batista dictatorship, did basically whatever the United States wanted. And the Cuban Communist Party actually had, for a time in the Second World War, 2 ministers within that government. Now, the particular reason that they supported this capitalist dictatorship was because the Soviet Union was allied with the United States in the war against the Nazis, basically. And so, in an opportunist manner, Moscow basically declared that all the local communist parties throughout the world had to support the United States as their ally, had to back it up. And of course, Batista, as an obvious ally of the United States, also merited support. So that really discredited the Communist Party in the eyes of the radicalized workers and youth within Cuba. So that wasn't actually Castro's roots into politics. Castro actually joined a breakaway, or helped form a breakaway from the Ortodoxo Party, which was a sort of left-liberal party, I suppose. It was a sort of anti-corruption, anti-Batista party, but by no means socialist or communist. That was in the early 1950s. And this breakaway group was quite a militaristic kind of organisation. And this is a phenomenon, of course, you find in many countries in the world, especially in colonial or ex-colonial countries facing acute national oppression or dictatorship, that the revolutionary struggle would often take this form of these sort of small conspiratorial military organisations. And so they actually assaulted a barracks in 1953, but that failed, and about half of the participants in that assault were actually killed. Obviously Castro was not killed in that assault, but he did go to jail and was in court. Now, his court appearance was very famous. He used it as, like many revolutionaries have done in the past, as a fantastic opportunity to expound his program, really, and to defend his actions, not just to the court, but really to the people, to the masses. And that's where his famous words were issued, where he said, "Condemn me, but history will absolve me." That was actually said then, a long time before taking power. And that's out of this came what was called the July 26th Revolutionary Movement, which he led and which he summarised the key points of its revolutionary programme, which he issued here, were as follows, and I'll read them out. They were the reinstatement of the 1940 Cuban Constitution, agrarian reform, that is, giving the land to the peasants away from the rich landlords, essentially, the right of industrial workers to a 30% share of company profits, and the right of sugar workers, which is a key industry for Cuba, to receive 55% of the company's profits, and the confiscation of holdings of those found guilty of fraud under the previous administrations. Now that programme, in its entirety, which I've just read out, is not really a socialist or a revolutionary programme. It's a kind of very left-wing, kind of liberal or progressive programme, I suppose you could call it, a programme of national emancipation from, an imperialist oppressor. But really, in itself, just confined to those demands. Of course, it doesn't question private ownership of the means of production, although it does call for a portion of the profits to go to the workers. But it doesn't question the right of the means of production to be owned privately. And actually, the call for an agrarian reform is really a classical part of the programme of the bourgeois revolution, in which the remnants of feudalism were essentially done away with by giving the land to the peasants away from the feudal landlords. So in itself, not a communist or socialist programme. Then there was another failed attempt at taking power militaristically in 1956, from which Castro fled into the mountains with only with a handful, basically, of men by his side, so very weak forces. And what it's interesting to note what this tells us about Castro, the combination of these things, that is the bold left-wing, although not communist program, and then on the other hand, the boldness of his actions in attempting to take power by military means and then fleeing. They tell us that he was an unusually determined leader, as compared with, say, other left-wing liberal leaders in many parts of the world. And that's important to note for the development of things in the Cuban Revolution. But having fled to the mountains only 3 years before taking power in 1956, with such a small bunch of ragtag rebels, we have to ask ourselves the question of how on earth did this group come to power? And actually, in almost all cases, and unfortunately this proved to be the case for Che Guevara, the sort of rural guerrilla method of coming to power, of overthrowing the old regime, is actually not a particularly fruitful one. In most cases in history it fails, and you only have to look at the FARC in Colombia to see that it usually ends up in this dead end, really, of perpetual violence and the receding into the background of the political aims and just the armed struggle for its own sake, almost. That's normally the case. There are a couple of times in history, and Cuba is one of them, where it's actually been victorious. The other obvious example, I suppose, apart from possibly Vietnam, is China. And so we have to ask ourselves why this happened. Again, this is very telling about the nature personally of Castro, which does enter into, as a very important factor, his personality. It is important in understanding why the revolution went the way it did and why it was victorious. And it's also useful for shedding light on the nature of revolutions in the epoch of imperialism. So first of all, the first factor in why I would say that they won their struggle in only 3 years was the extreme rottenness of the old regime, of the Batista dictatorship. It was hated, it was blatantly corrupt. Of course, it was a dictatorship, it had no legitimacy, and it defended the rich at the expense of the poor. So that was really rotten and was kind of probably on the way out, possibly anyway. And this is also reflected in the fact that even the middle class and large layers of the relatively well-off peasantry were also relatively sympathetic to Castro. In fact, layers of the urban middle class and even the smaller layers of the bourgeoisie were initially relatively sympathetic to Castro's movement. So the regime had lost a lot of its support. But on the other hand, and this is the most crucial factor that we have to emphasize, was the revolutionary methods with which this guerrilla struggle was carried out. And even in that respect, actually, it really stands out as compared with, say, Mao in China. For instance, wherever they went, they offered agrarian reform. So obviously a guerrilla struggle in the countryside, you occupy parts of the countryside. And where they occupied, they actually would give the land over to the peasants and encourage them to take matters into their own hands. So they raised them to stand on their own 2 feet. So of course that gave them a big base of support in the countryside, which is invaluable. It gives you almost a whole network of spies across the whole of society, because all the peasants are rooting for you essentially and will tell you what's going on, or will put obstacles in the way of your enemy, that kind of thing. And that is similar to the Chinese Revolution and Mao, where Mao also in the Civil War, where the Chinese communists would go, they would give land to the peasants and also offer land to the conscripts in the opposing army. And also that did contribute in both cases, especially in Cuba, to the demoralization of the army, of the conscripts in the army who didn't want to fight this guy who they actually sympathized with. And finally, perhaps even more interestingly, on the cusp of coming to power, Castro actually called on the working class of the cities to strike, to organize a revolutionary general strike, to cripple the old regime. And this is the statement that he made in the early hours of January the 1st, 1959. He said, "Revolution, yes, military coup, no. To steal the victory from the people will only make the war longer. The people, and particularly the workers of the Republic, must remain alert and follow Radio Rebelde, and urgently prepare in all workplaces for the general strike, which will begin as soon as the order is given, if necessary, to counter any attempt at a counter-revolutionary coup. So you can see that quite a bold method. He wasn't afraid to encourage the working class and the downtrodden to stand on their own feet. And actually, in that respect, was quite profoundly different to Mao in China, who actually, although offering agrarian reform to the peasantry, never really encouraged the Chinese working class in the cities to take matters into their own hands, to organise strike committees, to aid them. He wanted them actually largely passive. But that is different, and that obviously aided his coming to power, crippled the old regime, and of course won him the enthusiastic support of the masses. Now, just to explain exactly why the Batista dictatorship was so rotten and so loathed, as I said, it was considered like the casino and the brothel of the United States. In fact, in 1958, the year before they came to power, there were more registered sex workers in Cuba than there were mine workers, and mining is an important industry for Cuba. So that's an incredibly significant thing. The percentage, a quarter of the population was illiterate, and actually the number of children in school who were illiterate was actually higher in the 1950s than it had been in 1920. Only 15% of houses in the cities and 1% of those in the countryside had a bathroom to speak of. And yet at the same time in Havana there were more Cadillacs than in any other city in the world. So you see the tremendous inequality that you had, very typical of Latin America. 30,000 landowners controlled 70% of all arable land, while 78.5% of landowners occupied only 15% of the total. So again, chronic inequality. Around 20% of the population was permanently unemployed with no hope of ever getting work, and another 20% of agricultural labourers were doomed to working 4 months a year in the sugarcane plantations when the harvest was on, and then the rest of the year basically just eking out a miserable existence. 13 giant American corporations controlled most of the sugar mill market, or most of the sugar mills rather, in Cuba at the time. And almost all the wealth under the ground, as I said, mining was important for Cuba, that is nickel, iron, copper, manganese, chrome and tungsten. Almost all of this was controlled by American corporations, which paid poverty wages and basically considered this part of their strategic resources, basically just owned by the United States. None of that wealth really flowed into Cuba at all. And obviously to crown all of this, you have this brutal dictatorship serving the interests of this tiny minority of rich people and Americans at the expense of the majority. So it's hardly surprising that it didn't have really any support against Castro. Now, so that's really what the reasons why they came to power. Now, in terms of when they took power, it's interesting to note that, again, initially was not what you would call a communist or really a socialist regime. And Castro was at pains to point out that he was not a Marxist in that way. In fact, in many respects, his model was the United States in terms of the constitution, the freedoms, the rights, etc., that kind of thing. That was his aim, in a sense. And the government that he helped to form was by no means socialist initially. So the president, Urrutia, was a judge who had no revolutionary background, was an open anti-communist and conservative. Prime Minister Miro Cardona was a lawyer and a conservative bourgeois, also obviously with no revolutionary record. And many other conservatives were in the government, such as the Minister of Finance, Lopez Fresque, and the Minister of State, Agramonte. So that was the situation, and really what Castro was trying to do, I think, was to really carry out a progressive national emancipation and establish a democracy and really appeal to the sort of more progressive bourgeois elements, more liberal-minded capitalists, let's all work together to develop Cuba into a kind of modern, prosperous country with democratic rights. That was the idea. But to do so, of course, to carry out national liberation in a country dominated, not just politically, but economically, by an enormous economic power, such as the United States, of course, inevitably means you're going to come to certain clashes with that country. And what I think this really proves brilliantly, unconsciously, is the validity of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, in which he argued in the early 20th century that countries in the colonial world, basically, in the oppressed world, would not be able to follow the same course of development as countries like Britain and France. In other words, they wouldn't have a bourgeois revolution, so to speak. That there were bourgeois tasks that needed to be carried out, like land reform, giving the land to the peasants, democratic rights, those kinds of things, national freedom, which are not strictly socialist. However, the way that imperialism developed the world economy meant that actually the capitalism that already existed in these colonial countries, or rather the capitalist class that existed, wasn't really in favour of carrying out even a capitalist revolution, because really they were just the office boys of the imperial masters, and that actually were also linked to the old landowners. In fact, were in many cases the same people as the old feudal landowners. So actually had no interest, they didn't want to rock the boat. Whereas in the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the merchant class felt itself oppressed to an extent by the feudal class and wanted to break free of that and to establish free trade for themselves. In colonial countries, the capitalists were really just had already what they wanted and were afraid of the working class. So Trotsky pointed out that actually the real agents of revolution in these countries would be the working class, and would immediately come up against the obstacle of the imperial power, which would back and finance conservative forces within the capitalist class to make sure that nothing changed fundamentally. And so that really proved to be the case in Cuba. So he, for instance, immediately, one of the first things that he did, that Castro did, was to move to implement land reform, an agrarian reform, to give the land to the peasants, which, as I said, is not strictly speaking a socialist measure. It doesn't involve nationalising the factories or anything like that. But it immediately put the backs up of the agrarian minister, for instance, and also many bourgeois elements in society. It actually led to the resignation of the agrarian minister, of the Minister of Agriculture. And many others resigned at the same time. So the president on the 18th of July, only in the first year after taking power, in 1959, the president Urrutia also resigned as they took these rather mild measures. And of course, all of this was backed behind the scenes by the United States, who deliberately encouraged these more conservative elements to betray the revolution, even from within. So it was particularly the agrarian reform. Also the lowering of rents is another important thing, and also the lowering of electrical and telephone tariffs. Now again, these are not strictly speaking socialist measures. It's not the nationalisation of industry. But Castro recognised that ordinary people were so poor in Cuba, as compared with workers in America or Britain, that they needed to lower the rents, they needed to lower the electricity prices, the telephone tariffs, so that they could live a decent life. But that again immediately came up against the obstacle of the monopolies that controlled these things, and again led to the resignation of more ministers and the sort of the souring of the movement from within in that sense, or at least at the top of the movement. And actually one of the best things, one of the most proudest accomplishments of the revolution, and again a testament to the boldness of Castro, was particularly the housing policy that they carried out in the first year of the revolution, in which evictions were abolished. So you couldn't evict anybody for not paying their rent. And you can see within that the beginnings of a step towards socialism, a measure against the market, a measure against free trade, so to speak. So basically you couldn't evict anyone for not paying their rents. And he also forced through, as I said, 30 to 50% reduction on all rents so that people could afford to live properly. And also eventually, a year later in 1960, the urban reform law gave all tenants the ownership of their properties, of their flats, so that it was theirs, they weren't renting it anymore. And actually what you began to see as this developed is, on the one hand, yes, the splitting away of the more conservative elements that Castro had tried to sort of woo into the movement, if you like, to give it sort of respectability. So they abandoned it as they saw him taking increasingly bold measures, actually carrying out what he had promised to carry out. You see that, but then on the other hand, on the other side, you see all of these measures massively encouraging the masses from below in the cities and the countryside and actually people forming themselves into revolutionary circles in the cities and in the countryside to defend the revolution and to defend this new government and the gains that it had given them, as they could see the betrayal of the movement from certain figures above, and to defend the revolution, of course, from the United States. As everybody knows, that was obviously a very real threat. And of course, then we have the beginnings in 1960 and 1961 of the expropriation of American multinationals, particularly in the sugar cane industry, with the sugar mills. Now again, of course, this might appear like a socialist measure, but in many respects it's just an elementary measure of national emancipation. The entire industry dominated by foreign companies who put nothing back into the country. And actually many bourgeois countries in the past have felt the need to nationalise industries, not to build socialism, but simply to preserve them from foreign competition. France, for instance, would carry out a similar policy these days. So not in itself a socialist measure necessarily, but of course it put the back up. It really pissed off the United States, obviously, and that really is when the infamous embargo began, and when the United States decided with full force to oppose this revolution. Now, onto that, regarding that blockade, it's really impossible to underestimate the significance of the criminal blockade of Cuba that the United States has prosecuted over the last 50 years. And everything that you read about Cuba, the conditions in Cuba, and the dictatorship that is discussed in the media, has to be understood in that context, in the context of a blockade which has starved the country of resources, and which has also created a kind of backs against the wall atmosphere within the leadership that helps to explain why the course of action has been taken that has been taken. So it's estimated that the 50-year blockade has cost Cuba, which after all was a very small economy, obviously an island of only 11 million people, it's estimated to have cost Cuba $751 billion over the 50 years, and has severely deprived the country of access to technology and resources and the ability really for real economic development. In a modern world, you cannot have in isolation. The whole world is really one giant world economy, interconnected with technology from different parts of the world being used to make one country. It's assembled from many different countries. So to isolate, or attempt to completely isolate Cuba from the world economy, which is what the United States has done, has obviously created an impoverished situation. Let's remember that socialism is an attempt to liberate humanity, not just with the formal freedoms of capitalist democracy, but real material freedoms, so that we can live proper, materially free existence, so that we don't have to live in this constant nagging insecurity that capitalism gives us. And how is that possible in a small island which has been blockaded for pretty much the entire history of this regime? So that has to be understood. And just to explain why this policy was pursued by the United States, well, obviously it was pursued to try to strangle the revolution and to discredit it. This is a quote that I'm going to give here from Lester D. Mallory, who is the US Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for Inter-American Affairs. He wrote the following, or said the following, on August the 6th, 1960, regarding the blockade. This is a quote. "The majority of the Cuban people support Castro," so he admits that. "There is no effective political opposition. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection and hardship. Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. A line of action which makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and therefore the overthrow of the government." That's a quote from an American diplomat, and that tells you really the thinking of the United States, and everything it says about human rights and freedom should be seen in the light of that particular quote, and of course there's many other actions the United States has pursued all over the world. It's deliberately attempted to starve the country into submission, essentially, and to deny it its own decision, basically, over its own, what it wants to do. Despite that, we should celebrate, I think, the amazing success story that the Cuban economy in many respects has been, despite this incredible hardship. To give some examples, They abolished illiteracy, which, as I said, a quarter of the population before coming to power was illiterate. That was totally abolished, as was child malnutrition. Life expectancy at birth in Cuba is today 79.39 years, higher than the United States at 78.94, and 16 years longer than in neighbouring Haiti, which is 62.75. The infant mortality rate in Cuba is 4.5, that means 4.5 deaths per 1,000 births, whereas in the United States it's 5.8 and Haiti it's 48.2. And Cuba has actually now today the 4th highest human development index rating in Latin America, despite the blockade that's been going on for the past 50 years. So everything has to be seen in that context of the blockade and also the successes that are quite widely known, I think, of the health service, the education system, but what is less widely known, the fact that people live rent-free and services are in general free to the population. So there's that security, basically. Yes, there is hardship, yes, there is poverty, yes, there are buildings that are not in good condition, which is largely a product of the blockade. But there is also a guarantee of a home, a guarantee of education, a guarantee of a good healthcare system. And that really can't be underestimated. And that explains the popular support that Castro and the regime in many respects still enjoys. And explains how the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was so easily defeated. It explains why 1 million people gathered in Revolution Square in 1962 to ratify the Second Declaration of Havana. So those are the positives. Of course, there are negatives in Cuba, and we're not cheerleaders for Castro, and we're not trying to conduct a fairy tale of how wonderful everything is. Although initially, actually, it has to be said, after taking power, there was a flourishing of culture and political life in Cuba. A giant discussion took place in society about where things should go, what kind of economic policies should be pursued now that we've taken power. That kind of feeling that we've taken power was there, and a discussion on that basis did take place. However, it has to be said that despite that democratic discussion and that vibrant political culture, which in many respects is still there, there are no real mechanisms of workers' democracy to implement these decisions and to really hold the leaders to account in Cuba. And I would characterize the regime in Cuba as a form of very mild Stalinism. Now, now part of this is an inevitable product, and I would make a criticism of Castro here, of the way and the methods by which he came to power. Because, of course, he came to power through a guerrilla rural struggle, a military struggle, as I've said, although, to his credit, he actually appealed to the working class to organise their own general strike, which they did. But, of course, as in China, although less extremely than in China, a guerrilla struggle tends necessarily to create a very domineering bureaucratic leadership, or an undemocratic leadership, because, of course, you can't really have democracy in a rural struggle. You know, you're fleeing from one mountain to the next, from one jungle to the next. How are the local populations supposed to hold you to account when you, arms in hand, are arriving and then disappearing? Although it's true they did enjoy the support of the population, as I've said, they gave them the land. Nevertheless, no real mechanisms of democracy were there, and certainly not in the cities either. It's in the Marxist conception, of course, the classical proletarian revolution is one in which the workers organise themselves and organise a revolution through their own democratic organisations, which a revolutionary leadership is part of, and through democratic debate and discussion wins the genuine support of the working class, and is able to take power on that basis, and thereby establish a regime with the mechanisms of workers' democracy underneath it. In Cuba, of course, that wasn't the case, although there was, much more so than in China, a flourishing of democracy and of elements of workers' control. As I said, there was a revolutionary general strike, but it was rather fleeting and without any sort of real control over the leadership, who were this dominant and very popular, of course, military leadership, arms in hand. So right from the beginning, it was difficult, really, for any real. And of course, as that quote from the American diplomat said, there's no real opposition in Cuba. Now, partly that was because of just the genuine support that Castro had. It's also partly the result of coming to power militarily. No real meaningful opposition, no real kind of ability for anybody to sort of to challenge them, and that did produce something of a bureaucratic domination to the revolution, although one in which was genuinely popular, as I said. It was inevitable also, of course, and this is not Castro or Cuba's fault, far from it, but it was inevitable that in the conditions of being, having the United States right next door, breathing down your neck, attempting to kill you constantly as they did, inevitable, of course, that they would fall into the Soviet Union's hands, and really that's why the revolution began to take a more explicitly socialist direction, because of first of all the opposition from the United States, and of course the opposition from the more liberal layers of the government. But then on the other hand, of course, the open arms encouragement from the Soviet Union to join their sphere of influence. And of course they had no choice, they had to go down that route, and of course, as we know, then only a couple of years later you had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So it was inevitable that they would go down that direction. However, the Stalinists in Moscow did struggle to sort of exercise control over Castro and over the Communist Party attempted to sort of Stalinize politics, and they actually didn't get that far within Cuba at the time. Castro, of course, had his own base of support. He'd organized the revolution himself, really, not thanks to Moscow. In that sense, was a little bit similar to Tito in Yugoslavia, so he was quite independent of Moscow, and therefore, for that reason, was able to sort of follow his own course more. However, as things went on, that became more and more difficult. There was a failure of a sugar crop in 1970, and then Che Guevara attempted to internationalize the revolution, which is the exactly correct thing to do, to break out of its isolation. That was necessary, although I think his methods for doing so were mistaken, but very honestly mistaken. And that failed, and of course he was executed by the United States in Bolivia in the late 1960s. And with that, and with the failure of the sugar crop in 1970, Cuba became more and more dependent on the Soviet Union. And you saw what was called the 5 grey years in the mid-70s, in which essentially Cuba was quite thoroughly Stalinized, in which socialist realism as a sort of artistic form was imposed, and of course this very bureaucratic, anti-democratic methods were imposed from above. But that only lasted 5 years. It has to be said anyway, but Cuba obviously was very dependent on the Soviet Union. For instance, about 63% of Cuban imports were from the Soviet Union, and 80% of its machinery imports were from the Soviet Union. And of course, that vanished with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, which was an absolute disaster for Cuba as well, as everybody I think knows. Cuba's import capacity plunged by 70% at that period, and its GDP fell by 35%. Nevertheless, it survived. Now, Castro has Fidel Castro, I think, in terms of the future, because this is really what I want to finish on, the future of the revolution. Castro, I think, has been recognized as an obstacle to the restoration of capitalism within Cuba. Unlike in the Soviet Union and in China, where the leadership of those countries essentially betrayed the planned economy and basically converted themselves into capitalists and converted the whole country into a capitalist one. Castro, to his credit, has opposed that and has actually called for, has actually criticised the elements of bureaucracy and privilege that exist within the planned economy in Cuba. So, of course, his death is obviously a very worrying thing for those who want to see Cuba remain as a planned economy, as I do. So we'll have to see what happens. But clearly Cuba now is in a very desperate situation. It was kind of rescued a little bit after the collapse of the Soviet Union by the Venezuelan Revolution and by Chavez sending basically very cheap oil to Cuba in exchange for doctors. And by the way, Cuba sends doctors all over the world. That's actually its biggest export, to help basically countries in need, which is an interesting thing to compare to what Britain and America do, where they basically send bombs around the world to deal with their problems. But anyway, so Cuba is obviously in a rather desperate situation now, and the Venezuelan Revolution appears to be in trouble. And in general in Latin America we see a tide of more right-wing governments coming to power, such as in Argentina and in Brazil. So Cuba's facing a very difficult situation, and there's obviously tremendous pressure within Cuba to go down what they call a Chinese or a Vietnamese road. In other words, to open up to the market. And to a certain extent, that's probably unavoidable. And in fact, of course, Castro himself followed such a course to a certain extent in the 90s by opening up the economy to tourism and all the evils that obviously brings. But that was done, obviously, in order to give some investment into the economy, some much-needed investment. And to be honest, I think that was unavoidable. But today, it really stands at a crossroads. And I think that there's pressure, obviously a huge pressure, to open up to get investment, basically, from abroad. America, under Obama, is obviously going to lessen the blockade or get rid of it completely. However, obviously, Trump now coming to power puts a question mark over that. But that's, to be honest, the blockade from America's point of view has been seen to be a failure. And actually, to a certain extent, strengthened Castro because obviously gave him an excuse, gave him a giant political enemy to rail against, and a very real enemy as well. And I think in the end, obviously, the more intelligent sections of the American ruling class really recognise that probably we need to move towards trading with Cuba, and actually in doing so undermine the revolution by kind of encouraging capitalist developments within Cuba. I think that's probably the inevitable way that probably the largest section of the bureaucracy, that is the relatively privileged managers of the state-owned industries, want things to go. So what position should Marxists take? Should revolutionaries take? Well, I think absolutely, unquestionably, we cannot stand for the reintroduction of capitalism in Cuba. First of all, it has to be pointed out that the reintroduction of capitalism in Cuba would not create a giant success story like China or something like that. Cuba is not an enormous country with huge reserves of cheap labour and a powerful state apparatus to sort of protect and build up national champions so they can challenge on the world arena. It is not in such a position. And arguably, I think the reintroduction of capitalism in Cuba would make it much more similar, much more akin to other Latin American and particularly Central American economies that are close to America, which would basically create unbelievable inequality and mass unemployment within Cuba. And of course, the reintroduction of many evils like the oligarchy, like widespread prostitution and other kinds of things. Also similar to what Russia has, of course, seen, the reintroduction of capitalism there has hardly led to a sort of brilliant success story that they would like it to be. I think that's the reality of what will happen in Cuba, and you'll see obviously the loss of the nationalised healthcare system and of the guaranteed housing for everybody and all those kinds of things. You see an enormous rise in homelessness and not just inequality between the classes but also between the regions. That would also resurface on a massive scale. So that, I think, cannot be advocated, and I don't think any kind of bourgeois democracy that they would dangle would be really a fig leaf for the dictatorship of capitalism. And it would be very corrupt. If they managed to establish a genuine bourgeois democracy within Cuba, it would be really dominated by the United States, just like most Central American political democracies are dominated by American money, by American interests, and would be thoroughly corrupt. So what would we propose? Well, what we would propose to tackle the problems of low productivity and corruption, which of course are there. There's obviously a black market, and obviously there are problems of low productivity, largely because Cuba is starved of access to the market, to the world market, and to its technology. But also there's a kind of a cynical and a demoralised attitude which creeps in basically Stalinized planned economies, where you don't have capitalism, which is great, but on the other hand, the workers don't have real democratic control over their workplaces. And there's a cynical saying in Cuba that goes something like, the state pretends to pay us and we pretend to work. And it's a product of really, well, first, obviously, again, the blockade, the starving of resources, so there's nothing really to pay people. There's no real resources to go around. But then on the other hand, it's a product of a bureaucratic approach to managing a planned economy rather than a real workers' democracy in the workplaces. If you don't have control over your workplace, and if you see the managers of your industry taking a few products off the side to sell on the black markets, then you become cynical yourself, and you yourself might participate in the black market in taking things off the factory and selling them at a higher price on the black market. And you really would lose an incentive to work or to work hard, and you don't have any opportunity to innovate or to sort of suggest ways that your company or workplace could be run more efficiently. So what we would call for is maintaining the planned economy so that you have all the benefits of that, the healthcare, the equality, the access to housing, etc., the education system, but also the reintroduction of genuine workers' democracy. In other words, not just the ability for workers to let off some steam or to sort of occasionally have their opinions consulted upon, which is kind of occasionally what they do, but really to have actual control over their workplaces, to elect delegates also, to form a workers' government, actually out of delegates freely elected from the workplaces. And that obviously that's workers' democracy, and that I think would obviously allow for, you could even have elements of capitalist investment from outside that was kept under strict control by the vigilance of workers' democracy. But of course, if you have capitalists, rich capitalists from America investing in Cuba because you begin to allow them to do that, but you don't have workers' democracy and instead you have privileged careerist managers managing things, then of course they're going to, like they did in China, they're going to be corrupted by that, they're going to buy into that, they're going to become part of that capitalist system, and they're going to further encourage its development, just as the old bureaucrats of China have ended up converting themselves into rich capitalists. So the only way to protect Cuba from the dangers of capitalism really is to have real workers' democracy, real workers' control, so that corruption can be rooted out in a democratic way. That's the only way forward for Cuba, but obviously even more importantly, of course, is to internationalise the revolution, to break Cuba's isolation. And of course, there's only so much that really anybody in Cuba can do about that. But what that tells us is that everywhere in the world, including in Britain, we have to fight to end capitalism, so that not just to help Cuba, of course, but also to help ourselves, to end the system of gross inequality, of insecurity, of endless economic crises, of unemployment. And of course, until that system is ended in the main capitalist powers like America, Germany, Britain, Japan, and now China, until that happens, then of course I think it's inevitable that these powers will stifle the existence of whatever planned economies do happen to exist, like in Cuba. Anyway, I've spoken for too long, so I've finished now.
Thank you very much. Can we give Dan a massive round of applause?